Hello, this is the North Pacific Gyre Robotic Sampler, prototype fabrication. In order to construct the devices that I had modeled up in the previous video, I went ahead and got an excuse to buy a small mill, but I had to assemble it first. So these are kind of like the very initial pictures of when I received the mill. And I started to assemble it, and the assembly went fairly easily. You can see here. A couple weeks later, I had a plexiglass framing system that I put together to protect the walls from oil and metal debris. And the mill was finally completely assembled. There was a little XYZ readout. And the first thing to do when I started to create the components was to mill out some good blocks of aluminum so that these they had 90-degree angles and they were flat and smooth to within a particular tolerance. So that was step one. Step two was drilling some countersunk holes that were sized for M3 metric socket cap screws. So you could see that here. The next thing to do was mill out a couple of small blocks, very briefly. And then mill those, I didn't have good video of that, but mill some angles and notches in those small blocks so that I could try an initial fit. The idea was that that small block gets screwed on to the larger block and form a lens mount. So obviously the first thing I wanted to do was just make sure that I could the screws were properly drilled out so they would match, and they did match. After that, I put them together. As you can see, they're the socket cap screws, and just did an inspection of them to see how they looked. And they looked pretty good. Those notches, you'll see the purpose for those notches that run through the bottom of the small blocks in just a few slides. After that, I wanted to make sure the lens fit, and the idea was to mount the lens so that it was parallel with the table. And in order to do that, since the front of the lens and the rear of the lens were different diameters, I had to cut different angles into the blocks. And so this was kind of just an early test to see how those angles looked. And the camera also impinged slightly on the block, so that had to be accounted for as well, as you can see there. And those notches again were for zip ties. I took a weekend off and visited some old friends and watched some buggy. And that was fun. There's a person in that buggy. I came back, and the next weekend I finished milling up a couple more components that you haven't seen before, like that one on the top of the screen there. And then I proceeded to wash those to get all the oil and aluminum fragments off of them, baked them in the oven so they would dry so I could do some preliminary fit tests again that afternoon, which you can see here. So here's, I had mounted the lens mounts to the actual T-slot table, and as well as the Tygon tube holder apparatus there. You can see the idea was that notch in the rear holds the Tygon tubing, and the hole in the front is for the light to pass, as you can see there, and it seemed to match up, so that was good. The next thing I did was test some preliminary illumination. That was a 5-watt LED. Just see what happened. I wasn't sure, and I'm still experimenting with it. Wanted to find a good way to illuminate that tubing. You can see there, so it's fairly bright. I wanted to make sure also that it didn't get too warm. You could see there it was about 6 volts, pulled about 100 milliamps. It was designed to run at 7 volts. It didn't get too warm, so that was good. And I have some images from some of that early testing. The first thing that came out, it was pretty hot in the middle there. So I wanted to work on that. I pulled the illuminator back a little bit, and it got a lot better. I'm still working on it, though. And that's pretty much the end of the mechanical fabrication. I've transitioned now to doing some electronics. So That's the entire video. This is for the North Pacific Gyre. Thank you.